Okay, so let's get started and introduce Adam Lewinberg. So he's the president of Postal Advocate, Inc. We are the only mail audit and recovery firm in the US and Canada. We manage a portfolio of over 85,000 pieces of mailing equipment for the largest US and Canadian companies. He speaks and teaches nationally on mail savings and industry trends. He's the industry co-chair for the Boston Postal Customer Council and a member of the Mailing Systems Management Association. He has certifications in CMDSS and MDC. He's a featured writer for Mailing Systems Technology magazine, and he worked for one of the largest mailing vendors for over 17 years as the director of national sales for Presort, tabletop inserters, addressing, hardware, software, and green offerings. He was one of the top 5 account managers nationally, working with some of the top nation's accounts. We are not affiliated with any mailing vendor, so we offer unbiased advice. Over to you, Adam.
So thanks, Doris. Thank you all for coming today. So what we're going to be covering today is what are the best-in-class ways of managing multi-location spends. And we're going to talk to you about things you can do on your own. And we're also going to talk to you about, ways that we have been able to help our clients if any of those things are helpful. But the key thing is we're going to describe what are the issues and what are the challenges. So first off, the challenges. We find the same things happening in every organization that we go to, regardless of size. The biggest thing that we have is visibility. Most clients don't have proper visibility to their spend, so they're not able to do the proper analysis. So we're going to talk to you about how to gain visibility to this spend and then what things to look for. What equipment savings process makes the most sense to reduce your mailing equipment costs? We're going to go into a lot of detail there. How do you eliminate vendor fees and overcharges? And the steps to finding these fees and then what to do about them. And every client we talk to has these fees and overcharges. Lost postage recovery. So as we have probably reduced 25% of the meters in the US over the last 5 or 6 years. Many places didn't go back and collect the funds from those closed offices. And there are ways to do it. And there could be sometimes large amounts of money sitting out there. How do you develop an equipment purchasing strategy that makes the most sense for the future? And we'll talk to you about some ideas. And if you need help, how we can help. So we've created processes and tools and people and resources to make this easy for you. So the challenges of managing mailing fleet assets. Okay, so the biggest problem that clients face is they have poor visibility. Many clients are lucky to even get a basic population report of their equipment. Invoices are typically unclear. As an example, there isn't a single vendor out there that on a lease invoice is going to tell you when your end of lease dates are. And that's on purpose and by design. Many companies don't have any control over rogue spend. And what I mean by rogue spend is maybe they have like a central spreadsheet of their locations, but what happens when sites get acquired, divested, when people go on their own to go get equipment themselves without following corporate protocol, that creates rogue spend that very few companies have a good handle on. Many organizations have multiple postage accounts that they use to fund and maintain. So this can create lost postage, it can create fees and overcharges, and then just also huge balances sitting around that don't necessarily need to be there. And do companies have the resources and time to sort of manage this category? Because there's a lot of minutia to it in order to manage it effectively, which we'll go through. From a pricing standpoint, you can't search the internet to figure out what this stuff is supposed to cost. So how do you know that you have good pricing? We're going to show you that in almost every customer we go to, the pricing is incredibly inconsistent for the same machines at different sites. And then how do you assess the needs of what each location wants for equipment? Is it done by the vendor? Is it done by your internal staff? Do you have the resources to manage that? And is there any central oversight on the process? And then the biggest thing that's happening is all the meter vendors are forcing their devices onto the network versus the current analog phone lines that they're using. Phone companies are basically forcing this, saying that, look, we're no longer supporting analog lines, and it's forcing the meter vendors to say, well, look, all meters need to be put onto the network. This is a big problem for financial institutions, insurance organizations, healthcare, government, who don't necessarily want all these meters on their network. But we're working through this with our clients to make sure that this can get done. But this is a big deal, and every account's going through it right now. So the first challenge that we find is every time we either do an audit for an account or prior to us taking over, we look at what are people spending for the same machines throughout their organization. And this is an example from a client, but it's pretty typical to tell you the truth. that we find huge variation. So this site, this client as an example, has 36 Model B units. And one site spends $345 a year, and another site spends $1,573 a year for the same machine at the same organization. So the low to high is 4.6 times higher. What we try to do, and we recommend to all of our clients, is to create some sort of fixed pricing model, some sort of catalog basis to eliminate this from happening in the future. We have yet to find a client with more than 10 meters who doesn't have this. So we can say this across the board, this happens at every organization until structure and standards are put in place. And there's a large savings this can create. The next challenges we find is expired or non-existent master service agreements. So we try to get all of our clients onto having a master service agreement with the vendor. We find that many clients either never had one, that they're just dealing with, individual agreements, or it's expired and they're sort of going on a past master service agreement. So with that, it leads to, this type of sort of rogue spend or variations that are out there. Lack of visibility to the postage spends and usage levels. So we find that companies are buying the wrong level of equipment. So we average 60% savings for our clients. And I would say a third of that is defined by us helping the client set up better pricing. So better, like fixed pricing, better contract rates. But 2/3 of that is based on people just helping people buy the right levels of equipment inside their organization. So we do this thing where when we do our analysis, we look at spend ratios. So we say, what is the equipment cost compared to postage? Proper spend ratios we find should be for low volume equipment like a 0.5. Think about someone who spends $100 a month in postage should spend $50 a month on the equipment. So that for low volume equipment. For high volume equipment, it should be 0.1, 0.2. So someone who spends $1,000 a month in postage should spend, $100 to $200 a month on the equipment costs. So like, 0.2 as an example. But we find when we do this analysis for clients, we find huge variations. So this is an example from a client. This is very typical. Their high volume sites are 0.42. So they spend $26,000 to do $63,000 in spend. That could be cut in half. Their mid volume tiers are spending $1.22. So that means these 64 sites spend $1.22 in equipment costs for every $1 of postage. But we find this uniformly at every client. When we look at the really low, the bottom tier of postage use, you find people spending 2-3 times, meaning they're spending $2 to $3 on equipment for every dollar of postage spent. And the main reason for this is there's a reliance on the vendor to help recommend what equipment people need. And when you do that, they're recommending systems that are probably very similar to what people are using today. And the problem with that is people's mail volumes have dropped. People's mail volumes over the last 5 or 10 years have dropped considerably. People have gotten smarter about how they mail things, whether they're sending them electronically, whether they're consolidating them to hub centers, whether they're using email marketing. People don't send checks as much. Most of that's going electronic. And, the invoicing is definitely moved to central hubs. So with that, what's left is a lot of day-to-day type mail, which doesn't dictate that you need that much equipment to process. So like I said, 2/3 of the savings opportunity is around this right sizing opportunity. Now, the other thing that we find is that when you go through a portfolio of equipment, the vendor inventory reporting is very infrequent or unavailable. Like some clients are lucky to get a population report or a listing of equipment. We find probably 50% of accounts, haven't gotten an updated report from a vendor in the last year prior to us sort of showing up. So if you have a preferred vendor agreement, you can go to those vendors and get reports, at a baseline, but there's usually more detail that needs to be filled in. But with that, we find lots of lease populations with varying end dates often going into evergreen statuses. So this is a sample from a client that has leases that are sort of all over the place, many of which have expired, and some things that are coming up, where people just continue to pay. And all leases from every vendor, unless you have something in your master service agreement that defines against this, have evergreen clauses that says if you don't renew your lease by certain periods of time, they can extend you for another year automatically. So it's important to manage these end of lease dates. The problem is, like we said before, on every invoice, there's no indication typically of what that end of lease date is. The date you sign the contract may not be when the actual lease started. The lease could have started 6 to 9 months after the date of the signing of the contract, based on if there was a remaining balance on the previous agreement. So there are just things to look out for. The more, again, it goes to the more visibility you can get, the more control you can have over this category. So the equipment savings process that we recommend, and this is working for our clients. This leads to 30 to 70% savings. You can implement this on your own. Our process, we average 60% savings by doing this. First and foremost, I know I sound like a broken record, gain visibility to your equipment and spends. Validate questionable charges. You'll find lots of fees and overcharges for vendors if you're not looking at your bills. A lot of times the bills are just going to accounts payable. They have no baseline of what to pay or not pay, so they just pay them. But there could be fees that you can get fixed. Negotiate enterprise pricing and terms. And there's specific ways that you should have some fixed price points in there, so it's not just vague as far as just an overall discount percentage. Then a structure for working with the locations on equipment changes without just relying on the vendor. Eliminating fees and overcharges, we'll go into more detail on that. And maintain postage balances and claim lost funds. So there's some structure around lost postage we'll talk about. And then a continual review to ensure savings. Unfortunately, this can't be a one-time cleanup. This has to be something that's sort of ongoing in order to maintain the savings. But it leads to a 30 to 70% savings when done correctly. And that's the best part about it. So in the analysis and visibility, so the most important step. So go to your vendors and get reports that list out your account numbers. So every piece of mailing equipment you have has 3 to 5 different account numbers. And most people don't know what they are, so when they get bills, it's hard to validate against them. You have an installation account number. You have a leased account number. And you typically have you might have a billing account number if you're consolidating your billing with multiple sites. And then everybody has at least 2 different postage accounts, one if you prepay funds and one if you borrow funds from the vendor. So it's important to know all those, so when you get a bill, you can link it back to the location. For lease, very important, know the rate, the term, and the end of lease dates, and what items are covered inside of that. Does it include maintenance, meter rental, postage advances, rate changes, all of those items, and what pieces of equipment from your inventory are included on that lease? Meter rental and maintenance agreements. Those things can sometimes be usage-based, so based on the actual usage levels of postage that you have, and so there can be huge variances from one site to the next. Maintenance agreements, make sure that it's equipment that you actually need and are using if you're having maintenance agreements. Sounds obvious, but we find it all the time. And know the model and serial numbers and descriptions of every item, so you can have a full visibility to your portfolio. We recommend going to your accounts payable and pull spend reports from the main mail vendors in the USPS. We do this for our clients because we find that there's all this rogue spend that people didn't know about. So they had maybe old listings of reports, but there's all this equipment that, from acquisitions, mergers, sites going on their own, that they didn't have any detail on. So accounts payable is the best way to find that, because there are set vendors that all those mailing expenses come up on. 95% of all mailing expenses come up on 5 or 10 different vendor names. And so it's easy to be able to pull those things together and then analyze those to figure out where you have this extra spend. Any account numbers you find, go to the vendor's websites, plug them in, because that will give you visibility to the invoices you're paying, the postage spends, the fees that you're spending. And then monitor your inventory, invoices, and postage balances online. We recommend that you do this monthly to make sure these fees aren't sort of getting out of whack. And find all active locations with equipment and set up a schedule for continual review. So it's time consuming to set up, but once it's set up and there's a process in place, it's easy to, it can be managed. And this is how you get, when you have this visibility, you can drive savings. So vendor fees and overcharges. This is a fee-ridden category. And we find accounts spending tens of thousands of dollars in fees and overcharges that can be eliminated. So let's talk about what some of the basics are. From a fee perspective, it could be meter reset fees that should be covered in your agreements. It could be, postage advance fees in the same way. It could be late fees and finance charges. When people typically are borrowing funds through the meter vendors, the interest rate on fees not paid in full, funds not paid in full, is 15 to 22%, plus late charges on top of that. So that's like one of the biggest culprits. All equipment has equipment insurance clauses inside the lease agreement. So what the vendors are saying that is you have to prove that you have insurance on the equipment. If you don't, we will assign our own insurance to you. And so we make sure that our clients, like, we keep a copy of that proof of insurance, submit it to the vendors to make sure those fees aren't like adding up. But oftentimes these go undone. So typical overcharges that we find for clients are things like invoices not getting in the national account discounts. Maybe you're getting charged meter maintenance and rate change charges when it's supposed to be included on a lease. You're getting billed for closed sites. You're getting reset and postage advance fees that's supposed to be included in agreements. Or there's loyalty points that are on one of the vendors that could go unredeemed. We found $5.5 million for our clients in these categories because we're looking at every bill and itemizing these things and finding ways to get rid of these. They're there. Every client pays these and has these issues. It's just a question of itemizing them and finding them. Lost postage recovery. So like I said, about 25% of all postage meters in the United States have been turned in over the last 5 to 6 years. So, and it's going to keep happening. People are going to keep reducing their meter spend because they just don't have as many meters and the postage volumes are lower. So the question is, does someone go to the vendor's website? Do they know their account number when they close the meter? They know how much money was in the meter. They go to the vendor's website. They fill out the form online with the postage account and that balance. Wait for the funds to be claimed, like sent back to them, and validate that those monies got sent back. It does happen. It just doesn't happen all the time. So we found $2.5 million for our clients in these sort of dormant accounts. This money's out there. Plus, we have a database of about 27,000 transactions that were turned over to the states as unclaimed property. One of the vendors turns the funds over to the states. The other vendors don't. They stay at the vendor themselves into perpetuity. And so it's important to be able to know where these funds go and to be able to claim your money when it's there. So why does this happen? It happens because offices close, merge, or just turn in meters. The money is expensed once they send in postage. So if someone sends in a check for $10,000 of postage, at that point, the money's expensed. People aren't keeping it on their books as an asset. In truth, all you're doing when you send $10,000 in for postage in a pre-funded account is you're basically just changing money to a different bank account. So because of that, or this money sitting on the meter, still an asset. Sometimes it happens because the advance account's used when funds sit idle in a prepaid account. So every meter has two different postage accounts. One if you borrow funds, like a credit card, and one if you prepay, like a checking account. Sometimes people fund one account and then they switch over to another account because one ran out and then they sent money into one, and so it gets confusing. So that can mean that sites lose track of postage in one of the accounts when they're starting to use another. So the steps to find your money. So find all of your account numbers to current and past meters. Any old reports you have is definitely the best. Enter these account numbers online on the vendor's website to see if there's any data available. Contact the meter vendor to validate if these funds are available, and then check the unclaimed funds databases to see if the funds were turned in. So, and the same holds true for postal permits. So if you had business reply accounts, if you had postage due accounts, pre-sort accounts, those things are the same thing. That money is still sitting out there. So if you need help, we can research these funds and help get them returned for you. But there's money out there, and the largest we ever found was over $600,000. But there are lots of transactions we found, at all different levels. But this problem is not going away. It's only getting bigger as more and more meters get turned in. Developing an equipment purchasing strategy. So what we recommend is, first, and we're going to talk about what are the steps and how we can help. So the first is use a national spend to negotiate better rates. That sounds obvious. We can pull the spend together for you for the US and Canada so you have the leverage behind all of the spend, including the rogue spend, to use when negotiating. We recommend running a bid between the main mailing vendors. Luckily, there's not 50 of them. There's only a few. There's Pitney Bowes, Neopost, Francotype Postalia, and Stamps.com. Those are the entire meter vendor database. Hassler is owned by Neopost, so you can go to Neopost or Hassler, it's the same company. So we have bid templates ready to use, and we've negotiated these for the largest mailing fleets, and they work. They make basically this category into a commodity that you can look at side, make it very easy for you to look at each vendor side by side to see what has the right solution. Negotiate a master service agreement in terms. If you don't have an active master service agreement, we recommend having one because they're designed to protect you, obviously, and you want to make sure that there's fixed terms in place that you can use. We can do a review of these terms to protect you for the future, and we do this for all of our clients, and we make sure that they have these agreements set up and that there's a structure for when they want to buy equipment. Define the order process inside your organization. Do you want to purchase, lease, or rent? And we can guide you through those options. We try to focus on like high level, and we can break that down. So you're looking at high level equipment, you may have one strategy, and then you may have low end equipment where you want another strategy. And those things can be implemented. The key thing is, how do you limit your lease obligations for the future to make sure that you have the right equipment at the right price with the most flexibility to be able to get in and out of agreements as equipment needs change? And then how are the equipment needs defined? Do you rely on the vendor to reach out to your sites and find out what they need? Do you have people that have the expertise on staff? What we do is we work with each of your locations directly to show options, and then we help them implement those changes. And we'll go into some detail on that. And then where are approvals done and how can these policies be enforced? We can manage whatever process you have set up inside your organization to make sure these rules are being followed. So how we can help. We can work with all vendors' data, and we can build this visibility. We can maintain this data, and we have a web tool that we think is, far outweighs anything that the vendors offer. We update this data monthly, and we use this data to drive savings. So I'm going to give you just a quick demo of like the type of data that we're keeping for our clients. So we use a system called Enterprise Advocate. And we designed this system to make it where there was one place for you to go to gain visibility to your spends. And you might be saying, well, look, I have all my stuff on pitneybowes.com or neopost.com or fp.com or stamps.com. But none of those sites give you a clean view of what you're spending across your organization to make it easy for you. They have pockets where they'll show you your invoices in one place, they'll show you maybe postage spends in another, but nothing is linked together to the site. So what we do is we land on a dashboard that gives you your total spend across the organization. So your lease spends, meter rentals, fees, maintenance, total expense, postage, and your spend ratio across the organization. Then we dive down to what's going on at every location, adding in if you have your own cost centers, divisions, or regions you want us to maintain, when are leases expiring, what are the monthly costs for lease, meter, maintenance, fees, total expense, postage, and we calculate this spend ratio. So as an example, this site spends $453 a month to do $166 in postage. They're spending $2.72 on the equipment. For every dollar, they spend $2.72 on equipment for every dollar of postage they run. So we then can dive into the location to see what's going on at that site. But when you have this detail, and we break everything out monthly on purpose because you're going to get some bills from vendors that are annual, some that are quarterly, and some that are monthly, and it's hard to pull it together in any sort of standardized format. So this gives you full visibility to everything that's going on inside your organization to make this easy. Some clients like to go into this frequently. Some clients just like to know that we have the data and we're managing to it and ask us to pull reports. But the important thing is that there's a system to maintain all this information. So then if we want to dig down into what's going on at a specific location, we click on go to the location, and we now have visibility to the fact that, okay, this site is spending $747 on equipment, they're spending $400 in postage, their spend ratio is 1.87, $1.87 on equipment for every dollar of postage, still way out of whack. We can see what leases that they have, we can see what equipment they have, we can click on an image if we want to see a picture of it, and then we can see every postage refill they've done, because every month we're downloading all their postage activity from the vendor's websites. We can see, so we know how much postage they're doing, and because we're calculating it. If they haven't filled a meter in 6 months or a year, we know that. What are the fees they're spending? Meter rental and maintenance costs. What are those account numbers we talked about? Supply purchases. Who did we talk to? And most importantly, what's the history on that account? And the history shows any contact we've made with the site, what's going on at that location, and then if the site responded back to us with what they want, a way to view that response. So everything's in a closed loop versus you having to try to like maybe maintain a spreadsheet. The hardest part of this category is everything's on a spreadsheet. So you have to try to tie together like what the site said, maybe what the vendor told you, and collect all that information on spreadsheets, which most people frankly just don't maintain. We're maintaining it in a system that's robust, that everything's updated real time. So when we have all this data, we find a couple interesting things. The first thing we find is that for an average client, 5 to 15% of their equipment just isn't being used. People have been paying for it. Either their usage levels are so low, or it's maintenance for equipment that they just haven't had or used for a while. So we find that the first step is to clean up this sort of like asset validation. And so usually this happens because bills are sent to accounts payable, not always to the location to validate what they're being charged for. Very few companies have a way to survey their sites about what equipment is at the site. There's little understanding when you get a bill and it lists all these model and serial numbers of what each model and serial number is. And then vendors have very little incentive to validate suspect equipment, because if they spent a lot of effort making sure that you had every piece of equipment, you'd find stuff that you don't have and they would lose revenue. So there's no incentive for them to do that. And at the same side, it should be sort of the client's responsibility to manage all of their assets. So, and we find that a lot of stuff is actually just sitting in storage or people are being charged for that they just didn't know. So the good thing is you don't have to search every single site. If you know the criteria to search for, you can like narrow it down. So if someone has 100 locations, you might only have to search 10 or 15 or 20 to find things that fall into a certain criteria. Our criteria is if a meter hasn't been filled in 6 months, well, that's something we should validate that they still have. If a lease is expired, we should be reaching out to that site to make sure that they still have and need the equipment. If they have maintenance contracts and meter rental agreements, we want to look into those to see. If equipment's over 5 years old, is it still out there? If they have equipment that's owned, that's folders, inserters, openers, shipping and tracking systems, as that technology gets older, there's less and less of a chance it's still being used. So we want to dive into those items. So what we do is we create a personalized email to the location that says, can you please validate these equipment and charges below by clicking on the confirm equipment button. And we send them pictures of what this stuff is, models, serial numbers, what the mailing vendor has as a description, and then we put that in English, so it's very easy. So instead of just mail machine or 15-pound platform, we'd say it's a 15-pound scale connected to the mail machine. So put it into English. And then why are we asking you to validate it? We're seeing that this meter has not been filled in 10 months, and we want to make sure that it's still needed. So when they click confirm equipment, it brings them to a screen where they can tell us, we still need it, no, we haven't used this equipment in a while. They hit submit, and then we get that request. We go to the mailing vendors to get things, canceled and taken off the account. And all of that gets documented here, so you can view the response to be able to see what the site said here. So what's important is that it's closed loop. So you can do these things on your own. You can set up your own inventory validation process. But it's important to be able to document, have a way to communicate with the locations, and then document what they actually need or don't need, and then a way to prove that you got those things removed for the future so the charges get taken off. The renewal process. This is the biggest area of savings opportunity. So who works with the locations to find the needs and provide the options? And is it the vendor or is it your own staff? And when the vendor comes, it's typically we find that the vendors are working with the sites. And then regardless of how good your vendor is, they still have a vested interest of revenue objectives to have the most revenue from your sites. So if someone has, let's say, an automatic feed mailing system and they're spending $200 a month in equipment, but you're only doing $50 or $100 a month in postage, is the vendor giving you the options to say, look, you need another machine that's $200 a month or maybe $180, or do you need a machine that's $30 a month? Or maybe is your volume so low that you should consider just returning it because the usage is so low that we should just get rid of it. if you're not having those types of conversations with your vendor, then you should really be reviewing this process. What's set up to make sure that when the vendor makes recommendations, it's the right solution? How do you protect against things like evergreen clauses? The fact that leases get extended if you don't renew by a certain point in time. Remaining balances. We never recommend people renew leases before the end of the lease, because if you do, typically you're adding remaining balances from the previous agreement into the new agreement, making it more expensive. And that's one of the main reasons that causes one site to pay significantly more than another site for the same equipment. Unauthorized lease extensions. The mailing vendors we're finding go to clients anywhere between 6 to 13 months prior to the end of lease, trying to get them to, by sending them emails to the locations themselves, trying to get them to renew their leases. And it could be something as simple as extend your lease now with no price increase, or you get a 10% savings by just clicking on this box or paying this reduced invoice. But those changes won't happen until the end of lease, which could be 6 to 13 months later. Plus, the people they're sending those to may not be authorized to sign those. So what we try to do is whoever's supposed to sign agreements, we make sure that there's some sort of letter at your vendor that says, this is the process that all renewals have to flow through. And if it is the sites, that there has to be some oversight to make sure that these types of extensions aren't automatically going to people. Unneeded equipment or wrongly sized models, making sure that you have that right sizing process. Locations not getting national account discounts. So how do you know that the location that is working with the local rep or the inside salesperson of that vendor, how do you know that they're giving you the national account pricing? Is there any proof? Is there any benchmark that you can validate against? And then do the vendors follow up with each site to make sure the new equipment set up and the old equipment was removed? And we find oftentimes this isn't happening anymore. As the vendors get smaller and downsize their staffs, we're finding that follow-up is falling off the wayside. So we developed a process that we think solves for these things. You can do all these things on your own, but it's important that you have this process in place. What we do is we analyze your pricing and terms. We help set, through the bid process, we set standard rates for certain equipment. So it's a fixed price. So we're renewing equipment at end of lease at fixed price points and we create usually 10 packages that are going to work for 90% of the sites that people have. Then we go location by location to define the need. So we're working with the site versus the mailing vendors. And then we implement the renewals and terminations, and we follow up on all of these, which we'll show you. And then we document the savings and notes in our system. So it's working. Of the 6,800 renewals that we've done for our clients, it's yielded our clients $29 million of savings, which is a 60% savings. And you can see, that sometimes it's new equipment that we're helping put in where there's new requirements. Sometimes it's renewals. The majority of the savings comes from renewals where they have X model and they need Y. And then about a third of the transactions have been terminated because people just didn't need the equipment. Their volumes were so low that they just couldn't justify it. And where we think that's a unique place that we're able to offer that as an option. So what we do in every site is sort of the same thing. We load your equipment and your inventories, and we load your pricing catalog that's been negotiated from this master service agreement. So we know that model X is $200 a month, model Y is $100 a month, or maybe you need to return the equipment. And then we'll send a personalized email to every site. We say, your mailing lease is expired. We need you to select the best renewal option or whatever the specific situation is. We'll show the site the equipment, the savings opportunity that's available if they pick the right option, what their current equipment was when it was installed, their lease number and when their lease expires, their total monthly cost and their postage, and then what's the buying process inside your organization. Everybody's different. Maybe the site has authorization to sign. Maybe it has to flow up to a corporate person. Maybe there's a certain review process. Maybe it has to go to a REBA. It's different in every organization. So we then walk them through this sheet to help them figure out what they need and give them a side-by-side. And where this sheet is important, and this is a little bit more detailed, is we show them their current equipment next to 2 to 3 options. One of those options could be a like-for-like machine. One could be a right-size machine. One could be returning the equipment. It could be PC postage, which is a growing concern. We'll show them the feature specs of the differences. We'll show them video links and brochures, and we'll walk them through the difference. I would say 80 85% of the time, we'd love to say we just email this to people and they respond, but 85% of the time we're physically having conversations and working with them and explaining the differences in more detail so they can know what they're buying. The reason that that 2/3 of the savings is from this right sizing process is because in the past, the client only saw the current machine, maybe an extension on that current machine, or a similar size machine to what they have. When we showed them the difference in cost between right sizing it to different levels, people make the right decisions. So we're not telling the sites what to get, we're just showing them their options. And when you show people the difference in features, is an automatic feeder worth $100 a month for someone who does $300 a month in postage and only 30 pieces a day? Probably not. And so when we can make those discussions and show them the financial impact, people make the right decision. So then a site selects the equipment that they want, and it takes them to a page where we can collect, did the address change, who needs to be the approver, who's the installation contact, and what are the next steps. We then take that information, because that gets an email to us. We reach out to the vendor, request the proper paperwork, review the paperwork, and then send that paperwork to whoever needs to approve that in the organization. Once the contract's been approved, we send the site an email saying, this is the new equipment that's been ordered, this is the equipment that's being replaced, here's what you can expect for next steps for delivery, system connectivity, so because everything needs to be connected to the network with a link where they can get more information, what they can expect for installation and training, how to transfer postage, how to return equipment, and then an operator guide on the new equipment. And then 4 weeks after that, we follow up with every site with this email that says, was the new equipment installed? Was the old equipment returned? Confirm complete. And until we get 2 yeses on this, this stays open, and we keep following up directly with the site to make sure these changes happened. Because that's the core of managing this. If you're not following up with the sites, new equipment sometimes never gets installed, old equipment sometimes never gets picked up, and you keep getting billed, and that leads to overcharges and issues. So we found that this process, along with helping negotiate the best pricing and then following a very strict right sizing process, that's what leads us to 60% savings. So overall for our clients, we've helped our clients save $32 million. Our average client savings is about $900,000, which is a 60% equipment savings. We're managing a fleet today of about 85,000 pieces of mailing equipment across the US and Canada. And, we've recovered significant amounts of money in overcharges, lost postage and fees. And every one of our team worked for the mailing vendors prior to starting with us. So the typical way we work with clients is we try to do a no cost, no obligation analysis of your mailing spend. So prior to us asking any client to commit, we go through the details so we can quantify what's out there. And to do that, all clients need to do is sort of provide us, a list of invoices, an accounts payable export, a location list, any vendor reports that they've ever gotten from their equipment vendors. And we define those based on what people have. And so there's no work on the client side besides forwarding us some files. Then we build the best-in-class reporting and detail around it. We analyze the spend, looking for contract compliance, billing errors, fees, overcharges, and create a right-sizing plan that would last 3 to 4 years. And identify any savings opportunities. So from here, we ask clients to say, look, if they will show them the savings over the next 4 years, and we then from there, they can make an informed decision of, do they need a partner for this or not? And if nothing else, as a client, you get better reporting than you have today. And then if you do decide that we should move forward, we submit the credit request, lost postage and fees. We negotiate pricing on your behalf. We create a catalog. We help you create your master service agreement. And then we work directly with all your sites around asset validation, right sizing, and termination. We present every savings to you for approval. We don't do anything without your approval. We maintain it in our web dashboard. And because typically you're going to have leases that go out 3 or 4 years, we manage this portfolio for you, usually for, on multi-year agreements, to maintain this for you. Because like I said, it needs continual review in order to develop savings. We work with the largest organizations in the US and Canada, 8 of the top 25 banks, 3 of the 4 top uniform companies, 3 of the top 10 insurance companies, 1 of the top 2 pharmacies. It doesn't necessarily matter what type of organization you are. It just matters that you have a decent sized fleet of mailing equipment. And usually that's anywhere between 20 devices up to 2,000. So 20 locations with equipment up to 2,000 locations. That's our max, although, and I think some of the biggest fleets are around that size, but we certainly can handle more. It's just that's the biggest we handle today. So this analysis we talked about, we can turn around in 2 to 3 weeks, and it outlines the spend and specific savings opportunities across the board. So, and we'll give you all the detail on what your equipment costs are today, what we could bring them down to over the next few years, any fees, contract violations, any lost postage we can find, and we can do permanent analysis as well. And we'll be able to present the savings to you so you can see what's going on inside your organization. So again, a lot of this stuff you could do yourself if you want to put the resources to it. It's just a question of doing the work. So no matter what, the way to save money in this is to gain visibility to your equipment and spends. Validate any questionable charges, negotiate enterprise pricing and terms, make sure that you have an updated master service agreement that doesn't just say we get a 15% discount on equipment and we get 10% maintenance discounts. You need specific pricing packages that are defined that best suit the needs of your organization so you can put this into a catalog. And that's the only way to eliminate one site spending, $100 a month and another site spending $300 a month for the same machine. Work with locations directly on the equipment changes. Either you work directly with your sites or you validate that there's a very strict process the vendors have to follow. Eliminate fees and overcharges. Make sure that you've got control of if you're spending money on those things. Maintain your postage balances and claim loss funds. The money is out there, I'm telling you. And then create a continual review to ensure savings. And this process leads to 30 to 70% savings. We've had clients as high as 90%, in following this process. And the lowest we've ever seen a client is 35%. That's the lowest we've ever had. So we strongly recommend you follow this process with or without us. But there are ways to make it easy, and there are ways to save money on this that most organizations are missing.